Hello, Happy New Year to you. I just want to discuss what is called uh, GLUTs, which actually stands for uh, glucose transporter. Um, the first question we ask is, why do we need a transporter for glucose into the cell? And of course, the answer to that is that glucose is hydrophilic. And remember that glucose as a molecule has many hydroxy group. If you draw the link structure or straight structure of glucose, you remember that it has uh, quite a number of hydroxy group, and that makes it to be hydrophilic. And as a rule, which you actually discussed on the cell membrane, hydrophilic molecule don't get to enter into the cell membrane unless they are very, very small, like you have in the case of water molecule itself and some polar molecules that are very, very small in size. So basically, why you need a transporter is because of the fact that glucose is actually hydrophilic. The next question to ask ourselves is what are the types of GLUT transporters you have? Generally, there are 14 different types of glucose transporter, what you call GLUT. So you have GLUT 1, GLUT 2, GLUT 3, 4, 5, 6, up to 14. But for this program, only about 5 of them are actually relevant. I mean, for the scope of your scheme of work, only about 5 of them. As a matter of fact, only 3 major ones are relevant. We're going to discuss 5 of them. Apart from GLUT, you have other glucose transporters such as sodium and ATP independent transporters. You also have what we call your ubiquitous. Now, ubiquitous are form of transporters that are found everywhere in the body. So, but for this, as far as this is concerned, I'll focus majorly on GLUTs. Also, not to forget, you also have what we call the sodium GLUT transporter, sodium dependent GLUT transporter. I'm sure you are familiar with that because if you remember when we discussed how sodium actually moves in the nephron, the proximal protected tubule, I remember I told you that there's a co-transporter that transports both sodium and glucose ion, of course, from the lumen of the nephron into the cells of the neuron. Of course, I remember I mentioned this. So, the first thing we ask ourselves is, let's start with GLUT1. Where are GLUT1 found? GLUT1 are actually found in the red blood cell. They are also found in the brain and in the heart also. So these are the 3 locations where you have GLUT1. And what's interesting about GLUT1 is that they are insulin independent. Of course, this actually makes sense because it simply means that red blood cell can actually absorb glucose without the presence, whether you have insulin or you don't have insulin. Red blood cell can actually get to access glucose. So red blood cell can actually heavily transport glucose, which they actually require for their metabolism, without presence of insulin. That's the implication of that. So where you have GLUT1 include in the blood, in the brain, actually in the blood-brain barrier in the brain, and you also have GLUT1 in the heart muscle as well. But you have it in a lesser extent. You have just a proportion of 1 to 3, because you also have GLUT4 in the heart. So the heart has GLUT4 and also has GLUT1, but you have more of GLUT4 in the heart than you have GLUT1, and that simply means that GLUT4 are more metabolically relevant compared to GLUT1. I'll get to GLUT4 later. Now, the next you have is what we call GLUT2, glucose transporter 2. Where's the location of this? They're actually located in the liver. You have it in the pancreas and also in the small intestine. And the interesting thing about them also is that just like GLUT1, they are also insulin independent. And apart from that, they also have IKM, and having IKM simply means that they will have low affinity. So that simply means they have low affinity for
glucose molecule. And it makes sense that liver and pancreas have low affinity for glucose molecule. Let's look at the liver for instance. It means that liver will only absorb glucose when glucose is in high amount or is in abundant amount. So because of the low affinity of GLUTs 2 for glucose. And this is very, very important. Remember that liver stores glucose in form of glycogen. So it makes sense that glucose is only getting to the liver and is being stored as glycogen when glucose is in abundant amount. And that is actually what the body actually desires. So only when you have high concentration of glucose do you actually have glucose entering the liver and being stored as glycogen. And that implies that a lot of the time liver will allow the rest of the body to take glucose for their usage. Only when glucose is in high abundance will liver taking glucose or with glucose diffuse into liver. If you look at pancreas too, pancreas, remember, pancreas actually contain beta cells, alpha cells in the islets of Langerhans. So beta cells too only obtain glucose when glucose is in high concentration because of low affinity of pancreas for glucose, and that also makes sense because it is when glucose in high amount that the glucose will be able to enter into the pancreas beta cells, and beta cell will then release insulin. Of course, you know the function of insulin will be eventually to lower the blood glucose level. So that takes us to GLUT3. Now GLUT3 is actually present in the brain, it's also present in the neuron, and also in sperm. So you have GLUT3 in the brain, you have it in the neurons, and you also have them in sperm cells. And they are also insulin independent. So your GLUT1, GLUT2, and GLUT3 are insulin independent. And that simply means whether there is insulin or there is no insulin, brain gets to access whether there is glucose or no glucose, brain gets to access glucose. That's what it means. It means that brain has preference for absorbing glucose, whether glucose is available or in high amount or in low amount. So absorbance of glucose into the brain is independent of the concentration of the glucose. And it makes sense because brain coordinates the entire body. So the same also goes for blood supply. Remember that the brain has preference for, there's preference for blood supply for the brain. The same way too, there's also preference for the brain for nutrients. If you check here, you'll notice that you have low Km. That's an implication is that if glucose if you have low Km, it means that you have high affinity of GLUT3 has high affinity for glucose. GLUT3 has high affinity for glucose. And that also makes sense because the brain always gets its glucose, whether it's in high amount or it's in low amount. So far there is glucose, the brain gets to access glucose. Well, the next one you have is what we call GLUT4. GLUT4 is actually found in skeletal muscle, it's found in adipose tissue, and also in the heart muscle. So both skeletal muscle and heart muscle actually have GLUT4, and you also find them in adipose tissues. Now, one interesting thing about GLUT4 is that GLUT4 is insulin dependent. You can see that this is asterisk multiple times to actually emphasize that difference. GLUT4 is insulin dependent. That simply means that for these tissues to access GLUT4, it is being influenced by presence of insulin. And I'm going to explain how insulin influences the muscle shortly, but immediately I finish explaining GLUT transporter. So what another important point here is that it has a moderate Km, and having a moderate Km means you have moderate affinity for glucose. So you have moderate affinity. GLUT4 we actually have a moderate affinity for glucose molecule. So when glucose molecule actually available, they can actually get into the cell in a moderate amount. Talking about the skeletal muscle cells and the heart muscle cells, and even the same for adipose tissue. And like I said, I'll be explaining how insulin control entrance of glucose into skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and also adipose tissue. That is for entrance of glucose or diffusion of glucose into these muscles are being influenced or are being controlled by the presence of insulin. That will be discussed next. Now the next you have is GLUT5. Now GLUT5 are actually found in enterocyte cells of the intestine. They are also found on epithelial lining on the luminal side. Luminal side is the side of the lumen. As you can see from here, this is actually the luminal side, because you can see that this is what do you call this? This projection on the surface of the membrane. They are known as microvilli. So you can see microvilli here, and on this microvilli, this will be the luminal part of this membrane. And GLUT5, just like GLUT1 to GLUT3, they are also insulin independent. And unique thing about GLUT5 is that GLUT5 are actually fructose transporters. They are used to transport fructose into the enterocyte cells of the intestine and also the epithelial cell.